Hello, world singers. My name is Tyler.
And my name is Brooke.
And this is
Cosmere Conversations.
Thank you all so much to be here. We actually have a lot of things. This is a special release episode coming to you at the end of the year. Happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Kwanzaa, every possible.
Happy New Year.
Koloss Head Munching Day. We celebrate all things here at Cosmere Conversations, and we are so appreciative of all of you. We're recording this just a few days before the episode drops, but we have a special announcement, and that's that this episode, Cosmere Dictionary Volume 1, has been previously recorded, and it was released to our patrons back in November. That means that it happened prior to Wind and Truth. It happened prior to Dragonsteel Nexus.
So it does not have any updated information that we would have gotten from that book. And that means it also does not have any spoilers for Wind and Truth. So if you're not done yet, you don't want anything to be spoiled, never fear. You can listen to this episode and nothing will be spoiled for you.
We will get back to our hashtag all spoilers all the time policy, but not yet. So this one, you are completely safe. You can listen to it. And even we were going into this episode with the mindset, impossible to spoil. We could not spoil you in this episode. And so we hope that you like this last episode of 2024. We are very excited for 2025. Obviously, we're going to be talking Wind and Truth all the time, but we're also trying to mix in some special things, and you'll just have to keep an eye out for what those special things actually are going to be.
LAFO, listen and find out.
Over the last month or so, we have had a lot of activity over on the Patreon. You can join us on Patreon at any time, but we wanted to give a shout out to some of our recent patrons. Brooke, can you just go back and forward down this list with me?
Sure. We've got Stephen B.
We have Heather C. Thanks for being a patron.
Matthew M.
Yeah, you were a big-time patron, a brand new Cosmere Knot, one of the highest possible tiers. So thank you, Matthew.
Jacob G.
Jim R.
Mike.
Wendy B.
Raul F.
And James. All of you and all of our existing patrons, we are so thankful. It is not something that we ever really thought or considered when starting this podcast, that people would pay us money. We are very thankful that all of you choose to do so.
Yeah, and it makes it so much easier and more feasible for us, who both also have full-time jobs, and I have another part-time job on top of this podcast. It makes it a lot easier and more feasible for us to put the time and effort into making these episodes that we do, with our very detailed outline notes, sourcing words of Brandon, finding all of the relevant quotes, etc., so that we can bring you something that is hopefully really valuable to your Cosmere knowledge. And on top of that, having patrons just makes for such a great conversation, especially now with Wind and Truth out. There's some really great conversations happening on the Discord. So listener, if you too have finished Wind and Truth and are dying to talk to someone about it, I know a lot of us don't have in real life Cosmere friends, so the Discord is there for us.
Yeah, so check out our Patreon, links available in the doobly-doo, and, wherever you are doing your searching, you can find us and support the podcast if you so choose. But for the vast majority of you, I know that what you really want are those sweet, sweet free podcasts with no advertising, and that's what you get here. We are very excited about 2025, but for now, we hope that you enjoy this Cosmere Dictionary episode where we talk about slivers, splinters, and avatars.
And we super appreciate your support and, again, your patience in getting you this episode that we have been working on for a very long time.
Yeah, oft talked about the Cosmere Dictionary episode is now being delivered. And this is actually a little bit of a special for those of you who are not going to be able to attend Dragonsteel Nexus. Some of the details and the research that we were doing for this episode has kind of transitioned into one of our panels, Cosmere 401.
Yes, the Cosmere 401 panel will have some additional information from what we are presenting in this episode today. And I think we will also plan to follow this up with perhaps a part 2, as well as potentially the recording of the panels. So lots more info about this coming at you in the near future. Today, we're going to talk about some of the invested entities in the Cosmere and try to get specific about what exactly these terms mean.
I think as we have learned more over time, these terms have really given us a look through different perspectives, different views, and we're getting more and more characters, more exposure, and more understanding, sometimes from shards or other high-level invested entities giving us perspective. But there's really kind of 2 major ones that we wanted to talk about today, and then 2 others are kind of semi-related in that fashion. And as Brooke said, we'll probably do at least a follow-up episode and maybe even like a running series.
Yeah.
If this is Cosmere Dictionary, and then we go through a couple of important terms to understand. So the terms we're going to be really looking at today are slivers, splinters, and avatar. And we're going to try to get a good understanding of those 3, how they are related, how they are unique, and give everybody a better understanding of these complex terms, especially when there's like different ways of becoming, different ways of seeing.
There's like a little bit of overlap or ways in which they can seem similar, or just ways that the words themselves are similar, like slivers and splinters. Sometimes it takes me a moment to like search into my brain and figure out which one of those words gets assigned to which entity. So that's what we're here to do today. And I think we should start with the one that I think is actually the most straightforward, that I kind of don't have any questions about, which is slivers.
Can you hit us with the straight definition that we're going to use for slivers?
A sliver is defined as someone who previously held at least a significant portion of a shard's investiture and has since released it. Sometimes this is also applied to people who have held the entirety of a shard's investiture and has since released it.
Yes, but one of the unique aspects is not only that example of holding the entire power of a shard. You can become a sliver just with holding a significant portion, and that what is a significant portion is not always defined. But we can at least say it doesn't always have to be a full shard.
Yeah, I think significant portion maybe we can define as like the majority of the shard's power. But the effects of becoming a sliver can vary depending on the intent of the investiture of that shard and how long the being was holding the power for.
That will actually determine how the changes we know a tremendous change to the spiritual DNA of any of these people who hold on to such a power. But some of those changes do seem to fade over time, where others are permanent.
Yeah, and if you are currently thinking, like I am, of Nomad and Hoid in particular, it is unknown whether Dawn Shards are kind of lumped into this definition. Do Dawn Shard holders count as slivers? Is there a different term for those people? We don't know that yet, but in terms of the very basics of what we know for slivers, it does seem like previous Dawn Shard holders kind of fall into the same camp.
Yes, and it's really just the question of, is the Dawn Shard a significant portion of investiture? Because it's not necessarily a shard's investiture.
Yeah, we don't really know what they are.
Exactly. So the mechanics do seem to be very similar, and so I think Nomad, Hoid, and Risen are all examples of Dawn Shard holders to keep an eye on.
Yes. Risen, as far as we know, is a current holder, not a previous holder. So she would be defined as a vessel currently. versus a sliver, which is when you give up the power.
That's an important distinction. But again, to keep an eye on, because we never know with these Dawn shards. It seems from what we know about Nomad that it makes you a target in the Cosmere. Yeah. And that might, spell danger for Risen's future. But let's stay focused, because there are a couple of known slivers that everyone, I think, is in agreement about. There are several words of Brandon that kind of clarify and make clear that these people are slivers. So the ones that we know of are all from Scadrial. They are Rashek, the Lord Ruler, Kelsier, maybe Thydakar, if you want to call them both the same, and Vin. Each of them has held the power of preservation.
Right. So those are all of our known, kind of no questions about it, slivers. There's another one that does have kind of a question mark that we need some additional confirmation on, and that is the Stormfather, and then maybe possibly also Dalinar by virtue of being bonded to the Stormfather as a sliver question mark maybe of honor.
There's so much that is detailed about the Stormfather. Part of that conversation crosses over into cognitive shadows, which we're not going to touch this episode. We're going to leave more time for that after our panel at Dragonsteel and kind of come back in a part 2 of this series.
Yeah, I think also with Wind and Truth about to come out, we might get more information about this, because I think the Stormfather question, the Dalinar question, like what is it? What exactly is happening in terms of investiture and realmatic theory in this specific situation is pretty complex. So hopefully we'll get some more concrete info on that we can share down the road.
Exactly. We wouldn't want to commit to something right now. Like, we feel like we have an okay grasp, but we're just going to get so much information so quickly that I think saving that conversation for a little bit later, probably December or right around the holiday time at the end of the year, we'll revisit for some of that stuff. So let's go on, because there's another interesting one from Scadrial.
We know that Telsin Ladrian in Era 2 believed that she would become a sliver of autonomy if she became a fully invested avatar, which of course then begs the question, what is the difference between an avatar and a sliver? We're going to dive a little bit more into avatars a little bit later in this episode, so just for now, log that piece of information away in your mind.
But we would say that this is a goal of hers and not something that she achieves. She did not become a sliver of autonomy, but was considered an avatar.
Yeah, I think for a short amount of time, she was an avatar.
Okay, pin that bit of information and let's transition over to Splinters, because we hear a lot about Splinters as well. And I think
this one is more complex.
Exactly, but now you're ready for it. So can again, you hit us with the definition that we're going to use for splinters.
A splinter is a specific type of fragment of investiture, a significant measure of a shard's power that has been separated from the main body of investiture. Now, while a shard's power is never really separated from itself because it's all connected through the spiritual realm, splinters are pieces of power that have been either released by the shard or removed from a shard.
Now, one of the key aspects of knowledge that we have about the greater Cosmere is that fragments of investiture or significant portions of investiture tend to take on sentience over time.
Yes, I think we can say just investiture in general, when left on its own, moves toward sentient, wants to become sentient.
Yeah, the power wants to something, and that is to become aware. And that's, conscious. So we could get into a lot of philosophical conversations about that, or hit us with examples of splinters. But we are going to try to keep this tight and keep everything in line, which is why I think it's important to say that splinters can be composed of investiture from a specific shard or multiple shards. And there's an understanding that all of the investiture is ultimately derived from Adonalsium or one thing.
Yeah, so this is like where I think it starts to get complicated, especially when you start reading Words of Brandon, because he'll be asked questions about like splinters of Adonalsium. And from what I've read, and we have been doing a lot of reading about this in the last couple of months, Brandon's basic kind of conundrum or philosophy around this question is, if you say, is this spren a spren of Adonalsium? The answer is kind of yes, because all investiture ultimately derives from Adonalsium, but that specific spren might have kind of the flavor of honor in a more specific sense. Does that make sense?
I think it does. Let's use an example here because we have a good base of understanding of the history of Rashar. Not really. Everybody doesn't know what's going on in the past of Rashar, but in the very basic sense, we have Adonalsium who creates Rashar for a specific purpose, and power of Adonalsium stays on Rashar, some of it becoming the spren that we know of as the regular natural spren of Rashar, flame spren.
Well, that's not 100% confirmed, but we know for sure that there was investiture left on Rashar by Adonalsium prior to honor and cultivation. So I think that it's a reasonable assumption to say that some of those more basic primal spren probably originally derived from that investiture. And then when the shards come to the planet, they both create new splinters that didn't exist before, that are immediately derived from honor or cultivation, as well as flavoring, adding their own flavor to the spren that already existed, or to the investiture that already existed.
That, to me, is the key, is that there is pure creation, if we want to call it that, and those are the radiant spren. Easy examples, honor and cultivation create the radiant spren. But the flavoring is also really important because now the wind spren or the flame spren, those naturalistic spren of Rashard that we think existed prior to honor and cultivation because they're powers of Adonalsium originally, they are now also powers of honor and cultivation and arguably of odium. Exactly. So like, that is what we have learned over time when it comes to Rashar. And then we think that applies elsewhere. Scadrial is a great example because everything has to be a blend between ruin and preservation.
Yeah.
It is a balance that exists in totality on that planet, which is why both of them combined is harmony, question mark, if that becomes discord.
Right.
But I think that's the best example that is really easy to demonstrate that flavoring concept.
Now, as we said, investiture wants to be sentient, and splinters are often sentient, often self-aware. A lot of times they have some type of personality. However, it should be noted that being self-aware is not a requirement for something to be a splinter. So as we've been talking about, there's a difference between radiant spren and kind of regular, lesser, lower spren. Those lower spren, flame spren, wind spren, etc., are still splinters, although they are not as self-aware as the radiant spren.
And I think it is demonstrated that for several types of those spren, there is a lot of self-awareness. There is a lot of playfulness and personality to regular wind spren.
It's a spectrum.
It's a spectrum, exactly. And so that spectrum exists. The way that Vasher, one of the 5 scholars, defines these characters are the type 1 invested entities.
And he describes this as being power that came alive on its own. So simply by the virtue of being kind of left alone, it has gained sentience over time because investiture wants to be sentient.
Exactly. And with that definition, it does introduce a little bit of a wrinkle because Vasher says came alive on its own, but we were just talking about the true creation of honor and cultivation, the purposeful creation of a splinter. And I wonder if we may have gotten too ahead of ourselves. But again, I think we should wait for Wind and Truth on this one. Because we're going to learn so much.
To be fair, we don't really know.
Yes.
We don't really know.
But the question would be, did honor and cultivation take a wind spren and elevate it or somehow change that wind spren into an honor spren. And
Or
so,
did the honor spren just naturally arise
from the
honor,
concept.
Yeah, honor being on the planet.
Exactly. So that's
yeah.
where we don't have enough information.
Yeah.
And then where we do have a lot of information is an important, sometimes crossover aspect of Splinters.
Yeah, because Vasher says in that same kind of monologue that he gives where he's talking about the different types of invested entities, he says that he originally thought that Returned, like himself, were type 1 invested entities until he met Spren. So this kind of brings up the question, what is the difference between a Splinter and a cognitive shadow / whatever Vasher is?
Yes, and there's more information coming about this later, but I think we can at least give the definition to kind of set the stage on the difference. So a cognitive shadow is the copy of the cognitive side of a person made by a deep amount of investiture, the spirit or soul or cognitive aspect that has not moved on to the beyond due to an expansion of their, again, soul, cognitive aspect, or spirit.
Yeah, there's not a lot of clarity in differences between those terms in the Cosmere right now, and currently different people in world particularly use those words kind of interchangeably to talk about the same thing. So again, more coming on like exactly what is going on with cognitive shadows. But I think for our discussion today and this question of what precisely is the difference between a splinter and a cognitive shadow like Vasher, some people might say they're basically the same thing, investiture that has become alive in some way. But I think the key difference is that a splinter, like a spren, was never a person alive in the physical realm. It is simply a chunk of investiture that may develop sentience, but that sentience can also be destroyed. Whereas a cognitive shadow is a chunk of investiture that used to be a person and is still retaining the imprint of that person.
There's a lot of different rabbit holes that we can start to go down. And again, we're going to hold off because this is just in comparison to the Splinters themselves rather than to keep looking at the examples of cognitive shadows. But Vasher describes cognitive shadows as a fossil, the imprint of a being that once lived. And a splinter is like a chunk of rock that was molded into a fossil-like shape.
So you might kind of look at those two things and they could look the same or very similar, but the difference is in how they were created.
And I think that what remains of the thing, where one is kind of like building up, even if it's shaped by these forces, to become a fossil-shaped thing, a fossil-shaped splinter. The difference is a cognitive shadow is kind of like the inverse. It's what's left behind.
Right. Yeah. I think another way to think about this is a splinter is kind of moving from cognitive to physical.
Great way.
As it becomes more alive.
Yeah.
And a cognitive shadow is moving from the physical to the cognitive as it was once a being in the physical realm and is now mostly a being in the cognitive realm.
And so Vasher presents one of the examples of return, but we also have the Court of the Gods on Nalthis, and Endowment on Nalthis presents an interesting example of these cognitive shadows, the type 2 invested entities, because it seems like Endowment is using a splinter of their power to create Returned on Nalthis.
Yes, I think this is such a good example to illustrate this concept and the kind of way that these things can relate to each other. A divine breath is a splinter of endowment. It's a big chunk of investiture that she uses to imprint the person, and then that chunk of investiture makes the person a cognitive shadow. So you could say that Vasher is both, sort of, or he is a cognitive shadow with a splinter, kind of.
Yeah, that's more of how I see it, is that he is a cognitive shadow.
Yeah.
But he has a splinter. He has a divine breath.
Right.
And the divine breath, how I would define that is the thing that is doing expanding, or the expansion of Vasher. What
Right.
Vasher was is expanded by the divine breath. It sustains the cognitive shadow. And we know that returned have to continually kind of fuel themselves up, but that's not the creation bit. That's the sustenance. That's
right.
the
And we
long
know
term.
that there's a big difference between the divine breath versus the breaths they need to consume to remain around.
For example, the divine breath seems to have a intent mechanism from endowment. She is saying, you get this divine breath, you get to be expanded and to become a cognitive shadow, but built in is the loophole that you will give up this divine breath. And it will, I think, kind of be recycled in their system that they have built. But in general, it's like used in some way. And I don't think Vasher is a unique example, but I don't think even he can override the divine breath forever. I think he will eventually give up his divine breath.
Sure. Yeah. I think we've speculated about that a lot, in that perhaps when the returned are made, they have an intent, right? Because they see the future, they decide that they want to go back to Earth, but, land, I guess, back to the physical realm to change what they've seen. And I think that is an intent. And some of the kind of weird things that we are seeing with the return is that they are not fulfilling their intent because of the system that has been built around the returned. But that's a whole other conversation.
It's a big conversation, but this idea of intent, because I think you were actually talking about intent for the cognitive shadow. And
well, I think just the piece of investiture is endowed with that intent.
I think that there might be two separate intents that are being given. I think the vision of the future is tied to the intent for the cognitive shadow. It's like saying, you now know what your purpose is.
But they forget it.
I know they forget it because they are bad, as I have mentioned previously.
We can't have that conversation.
I know, but in the
now.
predictions episode, that's what I was talking about. Like, they make mistakes because they are still people. But I think the divine breath itself has an intent, which is why Lightsong is the example of like realigning with his divine breath intent and his intent, and they snap into place in that one moment, and he achieves the eventual goal of all return.
Agreed. Yes.
That's all I wanted to say about that. Did you have any more on Splinters or cognitive shadow?
Well, I think this does bring up the question of then what does it mean to be splintered?
Yeah, because we see this used a lot, and it often is applying to shards. We talk about honor being splintered, and we could also theoretically talk about not the shattering of Adonalsium, but the splintering of Adonalsium, because he was splintered into 16.
We don't know that he was a he. Rude.
Well, it's not rude if he is a he. But beyond all genders of any type is how I would imagine the ultimate God figure.
Exactly.
And so
I kind of disagree that we could say that the shattering of Adonalsium was the same as a splintering. I don't have any like really good arguments for that point because there's still so much that we don't know about this. But I think that there was more thoughtfulness and like science put into breaking apart Adonalsium. We know that Adonalsium could have been shattered into different pieces, basically, in different intents, and seemingly the 16 shattered it in this specific way because they wanted these specific pieces. And I think that that is different than the splintering that we see happen in different conflicts that Odium has engaged in, where he has splintered different shards. To me, those seem like different things. Again, I don't have a ton of like super strong arguments. That's just my sense at this point in time.
Why I bring up that idea is because I do think that there's a fractal nature that goes both above and below the common examples that we see of splinters. So, for example, I think you could say that it would be possible theoretically to splinter, as in damage, and perhaps irreparably so, an honor spren or any of the spren, to break them apart into further pieces. And Adenalcium would be at the top, or, the far left of that bell curve or whatever. And it would be possible to splinter Adenalcium into the 16, and that the 16 can splinter themselves, and then things can splinter further down the lift.
Is exactly what we see if the shards that we know are sort of splinters of Adenalcium, and then we see that those shards also have splinters of themselves. Splinters can be further splintered. However, there is a lower threshold after which a piece of investiture is no longer considered a splinter.
This is actually great because we know that BEU's breath equivalent units become so commonplace in the far future of the Cosmere.
Yeah, seemingly that would be like the smallest piece of investiture that we could call a splinter, maybe.
Is what?
Would be like one breath.
I think that that's actually the position where it's clearly below what would be considered a splinter, where one single Nalthinian breath is low enough on the scale that it would be considered innate investiture. Same too with Stormlight. The amount of Stormlight to become a spren or something that could be considered a splinter is much greater than just the generic or innate investiture throughout any of these places. And I think that a Nalthinian breath counts as innate investiture, but divine breath counts as a splinter. So if we were placing the Nalthinian regular breath on the BEU chart, I believe we might learn this in The Sunlit Man, but the Nalthinians are the most invested regular people in the Cosmere, and they only have 3 BEUs or equivalent. Like, nobody has more than 3 BEUs in the Cosmere, and Nalthinians are slightly higher than the Cosmere average. So they have 3 BEUs.
Wait, one breath is 3 BEUs?
Maybe one breath plus soul, whatever innate person is. But yes, they are 3 BEUs, because nothing in the Cosmere, no regular person in the Cosmere has more than 3 BEUs, and Nalthinians are described as slightly above average because of the breath that they are endowed with.
That's in the Sunlit Man. I don't remember that at all, but I will take you at your word.
Yeah.
I do think that the innate investiture, any like amount of investiture that people are born with, is not a splinter.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And I agree. I think that if we were going to place then a divine breath, which we've often seen compared to the 5th heightening, that is 2,000 BEUs.
Right.
And so somewhere between 3 and 2,000, something shifts to become a splinter. That's how I would label it. I don't know exactly where it is, but I would say that Nightblood presents an interesting example as where the line might be, because it only takes 1,000 breaths, or the 4th heightening, to create Nightblood. The creator needs to be at the 9th heightening, but Nightblood is created with 1,000 breaths, and arguably they are either a splinter or a cognitive shadow, depending on how you want to break things down.
I don't think we can get into Nightblood at the moment.
I agree, because we still need to talk about avatars.
There's one more thing that I want to talk about in terms of splinters, because this comes up a lot. Are god metals considered splinters? Is a question that I hear pretty frequently.
Okay, can you describe more about what you mean by the god metals?
God metals would be atium, lerasium, harmonium, tanavastium, which
Okay.
is the metal that makes up shard blades and honor blades.
We do think it's an alloy, right? And it depends on the spren where the alloy blend falls.
I think that spren blades are probably alloys because most of those spren are somewhere on the continuum between cultivation and honor, with
Right.
some being more cultivation based and some being more honor based and some being more of an even split. We don't have confirmation on that. I think we do have confirmation that honor blades are tanavastium.
Exactly. Great
Yeah.
distinction there. So the honor blades are a splinter. That's the question. I'm not saying they are definitely. I'm saying that would be the question. Is tanavastium in its pure form, when split off purposefully by the shard itself, a splinter of that shard?
In my opinion, and from what I have read in Words of Brandon, etc., there is a distinct difference between a god metal, which is a physical manifestation of investiture, similar to a perpendicularity, versus a splinter. Splinters do not have very much presence or substance in the physical realm, whereas things like a god metal or a perpendicularity are kind of the power of the shard, that investiture seeping into the physical realm and becoming a physical thing.
So again, to relate it back to Nalthus, the divine breath we think is a splinter, but that divine breath isn't a held acorn-like substance in the physical realm. It's mainly a spiritual realm thing. We don't necessarily think that it is physical in the same way that tanavastium honor blades are physical.
Right, exactly. If we think about the way that spren present in the physical realm, while they do seem to gain physical realm presence as they have a bond, for example, kind of anchoring them to the physical realm, they still are not fully physical. You know, like when Syl touches Kaladin, he can barely feel her. She's certainly not primarily of the physical realm, versus something like a god metal, which is absolutely a physical thing that feels the same as any other physical thing in the physical realm.
Which is why the honor blades have been guarded by the Shin people for so long, and anyone can pick up an honor blade. It doesn't require that spren bond.
Right.
It is doing everything kind of in the physical realm, or at least like the main mechanism is in the physical realm. So I think that's a helpful distinction with those physical manifestation and those god metal.
Okay, now let's talk about what the heck avatars are. Are they also a splinter? Are they cognitive shadows? Like, what the heck are these things?
Here's the definition that we're going to use. A avatar is a form of self-aware power split off from the shard, or a person heavily invested and chosen to act as an emissary of the shard's will. These distinctions are important, and we are getting more examples of avatars, so, subject to change as always. But it's almost like a splinter that has these key distinct points.
It's splinter-esque.
Mm-hmm.
To me, the sense that I get is that an avatar is perhaps a splinter that the shard retains more control over, versus a splinter being like very much a clean break away into its own separate entity, like a spren, so if we say Syl is an honor spren, she is like fully her own person, although she is also a piece of investiture honor flavored.
Honor flavored. I like that a lot. Okay.
Whereas I think like an avatar would be, I guess more like a tentacle, maybe like an octopus tentacle that like kind of has its own brain, but is very much still being controlled by the main octopus of the shard.
That's a really good breakdown, actually, between being a distinct, separate thing that does kind of like come from the source versus being a tentacle of the thing. And most on display doing that tentacle thing is Autonomy.
Yeah, autonomy has the most tentacles. And those tentacles come in kind of different forms as far as we've seen, where some of them are simply pieces of autonomy's investiture that have gained sentience on its own over time, because that's what investiture does, while autonomy retains, again, some amount of control over that piece of investiture. And then there are also beings like Telsin, who was an avatar of autonomy for a short moment in time, who had quite a bit of autonomy as investiture, but was not left to her own devices, you know?
Definitely. And that aspect of choice, or how controlled the invested entity is, I believe is important. On Scadrial, we might look at the difference between spiked creatures and how susceptible they are to Ruin's influence.
Right. Yeah.
Where the more that they are spiked, the more like he's got the tentacles inside of them or wrapped around them.
Yeah.
Using on that planet metal, of course, as his tentacles.
Yeah. Another kind of comparison here that I think is helpful potentially is that as we see them, shards are sapient minds with access to infinite investiture. So we would call this a vessel and a shard. The shard is the infinite investiture, the sapient mind is the vessel. Avatars are also a mind plus power, just on a smaller scale and kind of not independently. So there is kind of a weird way that sometimes avatars can be considered to be shards in their own right. This is where it kind of gets confusing, and where we got stuck a lot when researching this episode is that over the years there have been some contradictory or just confusing words of Brandon about these kinds of topics. In 2017, there's a word of Brandon that seems to confirm that the island of Pat-G on First of the Sun is one of those 16 shards of Adonalsium. And then later he clarified that no, he meant that it's part of autonomy, but it's an avatar of autonomy, which is kind of the same thing as just being the shard of autonomy, which is a shard of Adonalsium. So Pat-G is a shard of Adonalsium, and basically it's complicated.
I'm so glad that we brought in the terminology of flavoring, though, at the beginning of the episode, because this is where that concept comes from. When Brandon is clarifying about what Pat-G is and how he kind of mistakenly said it's a shard of Adonalsium, what he later used to describe it is that as all investiture is coming and flowing from Adonalsium, Pat-G was an example of that flavoring process happening via autonomy.
Yeah, because if the question is just like, is the investiture in Pat-G from Adonalsium? Again, the answer is like, kind of yeah, because all investiture is ultimately from Adonalsium. But this specific piece of investiture has a little bit of autonomy flavor.
And I do think that the deeper connection between the intent of the shard and the avatar is significant. It seems like the avatars often want to be in line, like Telsin wanted to be a fully invested avatar of autonomy, or they are being forced to be in line.
Yeah, again, ironic to this conversation, but avatars have less autonomy than a Splinter would.
That's a great point. Is
lowercase a autonomy.
And I think that that is actually important, and the distinction between Splinters and avatars is significant, because what honor and cultivation do is not create avatars of themselves in the Radiant Spren.
Yes, and I think especially with the revelation at the end of Rhythm of War, where we learn that Spren can change, Spren can choose, Spren can start to become different. On my reread of Rhythm of War, I really noticed that as a big theme that was happening. That is different than an avatar. Like, I don't think that an avatar can change or can become significantly different from its home shard, sort of, or its progenitor shard, in the same way that a Splinter is able to.
Yeah, and I think maybe another example of that would be the fight that we see between odium and resa, the shard and its
Oh.
vessel, that when those things are not in line, it leads to the decay and maybe eventual destruction. I think that if an avatar was out of line with the shard that it was connected to, that eventually there would be decay. I don't think that it can sustain itself as an avatar without being in line with the intent of the shard.
Yeah. Do you want to end this episode with a little bit of speculation in this vein?
Yeah, I would love to. I think that there is an important point that is purposefully being avoided both by us when we are talking and because it's flowing from Brandon. Brandon is the source, like Aiden Alcium, and when he is displaying a little bit of hesitancy or
obfuscation.
Oh yeah, that's it exactly. Then we are doing the same thing. And that's when it comes to this question of what is a soul in the cosmos. We could clearly be very philosophical about this, but I think that what I want to mainly do is create this distinction between cognitive shadows and souls by trying to describe souls separately and to actually make the distinction that Brandon is kind of purposefully not doing. He's purposefully not doing it in the text, and he's purposely not doing it in words of Brandon. He's not taking on the responsibility of saying, this is what a soul means in the Cosmere, and this is how a soul acts. The word soul is often used in moments, for example, with Kelsier or with Eshonai at the end of Rhythm of War. And I think in those moments, it's more akin to a cognitive shadow. It is a cognitive shadow, but the word soul is being used. And we actually hear this directly from the Stormfather in that final chapter. Could you read this quote?
This is between Eshonai and the Stormfather. Quote, "She floated. So this is my soul?"
Some would call it that, said the Rider of Storms. Some would say it is a spren formed by the power you left, imprinted with your memories. End quote. This distinction, I think, is important, but it's also something that Brandon doesn't want to be definitive, and so he's portraying it in the exact same way that the Stormfather just did. Some would say.
Right.
People in universe would call it a soul, but he's not making the definitive statement, and so we're not going to give that as a clear definition, but I do think that we can see this on the page. Because when Kelsier dies, and this is Mistborn's secret history, he sees other people that are dying and they become cognitive aspects. They look kind of like people. They have a conversation with Fuzz. Fuzz normally like touches them or consoles them. And then what always happens, except in the case of Kelsier, is that little cognitive aspect goes away to the beyond. This is different than how souls appear as little flames in both the Scadrian cognitive realm and in Shadesmar. They're described as little flames.
Yeah.
That to me is the distinction, is that there's something regarding a soul that actually requires all three of the realms to be in line. And then as soon as you separate out the cognitive aspect, it pops up in the cognitive universe and it kind of looks like a person. I personally do not think it's a person, and I don't think it's a soul. I think it's just the cognitive aspect.
I think that there's a physical body, there's the cognitive aspect of a person.
Yes.
And then there is the tiny, like, spark of investiture, I would call it.
From the spiritual realm.
As we've talked about a lot, souls and metal look the same in the Scadrian version of Shadesmar. And I think that's because it is investiture. It's like this tiny piece of investiture that is the life inside of living beings. But when a person dies, that little spark of investiture is immediately absorbed back into the spiritual realm, leaving only the cognitive aspect and the body. And then the cognitive aspect is the thing that has the potential to persist if it gains more investiture to imprint on and persist.
Expansion. It needs the expansion because it no longer has that connection to the spiritual realm. I would probably agree. It's basically instantaneous from my perspective as well. Just like you're shut off from the spiritual realm. You have this little thing, this cognitive aspect that stays around in the cognitive realm for a bit. And then obviously the physical body is broken or decayed enough to have died. And so you're losing out on the connection. But what my main argument for what is a soul in the Cosmere, I would say it is the connection between those three things. It's not only the spiritual realm, it's not only the body, it's not only the cognitive, it's those three things connected. And then once you break it apart, the soul, in my view, is gone. And then you're just talking about one of the three little versions of the left behind. You have to have the connection, and without that, everything kind of falls apart. That's my best shot at describing a soul in the Cosmere. That's as philosophical as I'll get. And
I think the soul is the spiritual realm little piece of investiture, but we can disagree because there are certainly no hard answers on this.
Yeah, let us know what you think to that question, as well as our definitions of slivers, splinters, and avatars.
Yeah, what other questions do you have? Are there other Cosmere dictionary terms that you would like us to define and talk about? Let us know.
Brooke, can you take us away?
Until next time, life before death,
Strength before weakness.
journey before destination.